welcome everybody. Thanks for taking the time this afternoon to join us for this presentation on Socioeconomic Indicators, or SEI, in regional economic development. As Dee mentioned, I'm Katie Kuhn, and I have been working on these SEI features within the REMI model, so I'm excited to go through an overview of what these are, how these work, and what sample applications we can use SEI for in real-world policy scenarios. So with that, I'll start off with a quick roadmap of what we'll be covering today. We'll start off with a quick intro, go over an overview of the topic, take a moment to go through some of the methods and approach which underlie the development of SEI. And we'll look into a specific case study, discuss some notable results, discuss some conclusions, and finally have time at the end for a Q&A. So the first question we might be asking is, why SEI? The guiding concepts that answer this question for us at REMI is that public policy should serve the interests of the public. We believe that policy should be broad-based, the trade-offs and the benefits should be broad-based. And in order to ensure that that is the case, we need to evaluate how different social and demographic groups are affected by policies. Additionally, over the past year with the new Biden administration, there's been an increase in federal, state, and local regulations, as well as general stakeholder concern, requiring that that these SEI considerations be taken into account when applying for grants, when putting forth new policies and programs. And finally, American demography is changing. Building a diverse workforce is an imperative part of continuing economic development and growth across regions in the United States. So overall, these are the guiding concepts for why we believe that SEI is important and why our clients find these SEI measurements important. The second logical question is, what is SEI? So in this context, we have developed a series of features illustrated here, including compensation distribution, employment changes by earnings quintile, consumption price by earnings quintile and range. Also, we have an inequality coefficient, employment by race and gender, employment by educational attainment, labor force participation by race and gender, unemployment, and per capita income. So these are all of the pieces of SEI within the new SEI module that we have at REMI, and we'll go through some of the methodology underlying these indicators, as well as some sample applications. So now we'll look into a quick topic overview. First of all, to illustrate how SEI can contribute to policy conversations and decision-makers' decision-making processes. First of all, there's the example of two of the most broad competing economic narratives in the United States, one of limited government versus active government. And the tension is always between which method or to what extent government should ensure that policy is broad-based and what leads to the most positive impacts. So of course, there's a limited government argument that lower taxes and fewer regulations lead to more efficiency, lead to, in certain examples, lower unemployment rates, a more stimulated economy. But then, of course, there's the other side of that narrative that higher taxes and a more active government also has a very important role to play in creating economic growth and prosperity. So really the takeaway here is that in either narrative, SEI offers standardized, impartial metrics to guide policy. So rather than relying on ideology and intention to guide conversations about policy making and to guide conversations about the impacts of policy, we believe that the need for SEI is really to offer the standardized way to kind of meet in the middle and really understand what policy is working and what is not. So why care? The importance of a methodological framework offering these standardized metrics on key socioeconomic factors, I think, can't really be overstated. First of all, understanding economic, physical, and demographic implications of policies prior to implementation helps ensure that those policies serve the broad-based interests of the public and that the costs of them do not disproportionately fall on certain groups. It's also important so that policymakers can make predictions about the effects of policies, can avoid unwanted negative impacts, and can make most effective use of resources, especially limited resources. Finally, informing policy with standardized metrics rather than ideology or intention gives us a way forward for making policy that is better for everyone. And it helps us and our clients address stakeholders with evidence, communicating how policy can benefit or disadvantage their communities broadly. So with that setup, we'll go ahead and walk through some of the methods and approach that inform our socioeconomic indicator framework. So first of all, the question we sought to answer was, how can we identify and calculate useful standardized SEI metrics? And to approach this question, we used the American Community Survey, Bureau of Labor Statistics data, and BEA data sources as well. And from those sources, we developed new methodologies to set the industry standard for this SEI framework. So we'll cover a methodological overview of these key SEI metrics. I've again listed them out here as the core pieces of this framework, but we'll go ahead and get into a little bit more detail on each of these. So first of all, the compensation distribution metric. This was calculated using regionally calculated industry quintiles. So rather than relying on nationally calculated quintiles, we actually focused on the region itself. And using those quintiles, we calculated a weighted average for each industry's average annual compensation rate, and then used the industry's share, or each industry's share, of total employment in the baseline forecast as the weight. So to weight that annual average compensation rate across industry quintiles. And when we get to the results, you'll see these metrics in action, but just so you know sort of what underlies those numbers. And of course, at the Q&A at the end, I'm more than happy to answer any more detailed questions that come up. The other piece, the next piece, employment and price changes by earnings quintile. We approached the development of this metric by calculating the percentage change from the baseline forecast of employment for each industry group and occupation group. We then calculated using the weighted average of consumption, commodity prices for each income group, broken both into income quintiles and income ranges. And we determined the weights for commodity prices based on each group's national average share of spending devoted to that commodity category. And that information came from the BLS. So if you're new to REMI, new to the kind of how we run forecasts, I'll just say now, essentially, when you run a simulation or you model a policy shock or a policy change, there's a national baseline forecast and a regional baseline forecast, and whatever inputs you add into a simulation forecast, the results then show the change or the differences between the new simulation forecast and that baseline forecast. So when I talk about calculating percentage change from the baseline, I'm referring to those baseline forecasts built into the model. The next piece of employment changes, looking at SEI impacts, concerns racial and ethnic category as well as gender category. So to do this, we calculated the national shares for each occupation by race and gender using the American Community Survey. So you'll notice when I get to our results that the categories we use are coming from the American Community Survey. We then calculated occupation weights for each gender and occupation using that data. Then we estimated labor force demographic shares by place of work, converted commuter data from number of jobs to number of laborers, and then calibrated that by looking at commuter inflows and outflows by race and gender, so that we were then able to calculate labor force by place of work. And from there, we calculated the employment by occupation, race, and gender shares. That's a summary of the methodology underlying this new feature in the model. The final piece of the employment changes we're looking at through this SEI framework is employment by educational attainment level. So we calculated the number of new jobs created as a change from that baseline forecast that do not require a college education by multiplying employment by occupation by percentage of educational attainment by population from BLS data. And then we aggregated, in one of our tables, we aggregated these educational levels to show a summary chart showing bachelor's degree and above, so the jobs created or lost from the baseline that require a bachelor's degree and above, and those that require no bachelor's degree. We also have a feature where you can see more specific educational attainment breakdowns. So everything from some high school and no degree all the way through professional and doctoral degrees, and the number of jobs created by each of those levels of educational attainment. So all of these metrics so far have really focused on compensation and employment socioeconomic metrics. There are a few more that we will briefly cover. Looking at labor force participation, we can also look at racial and ethnic category and gender labor force participation and compare those to each other. Again, we use the BLS to calculate the national labor force participation rate. We estimated the parameters by age cohort, gender, and racial ethnic groups for a time-fixed effects regression. And then the participation rates by race, age, and gender were calculated using relative compensation rate, employment opportunity, relative employment opportunity, demographic characteristics, and national participation rates, and calibrated all of this with historical labor force totals. Finally, multiplying by civilian non-institutional population to generate labor force yielded the labor force participation changes result. For an overview of the demographic component, so this is the part of the model that covers all of our demographic results. We use a cohort component method to forecast regional population changes. And so every year we calculate the demographic, the components of demographic change by gender and race. And then the population at the end of the year, of course, is kind of the simple formulation of starting population plus births, net migration, and minus deaths. And we determine those rates of change based on observed historical regional trends and national forecast trends. And we do a bit of special treatment for those populations that don't act like others, those being military and their dependents, prisoners, and college students. So very briefly, just a few bullet points kind of summarizing how we approach our demographic component within the REMI model. So with that, again, a pretty quick overview, but I hope at least an informative one so that you understand the methods, the data sources, and the approach that we took to creating these socioeconomic indicators, and why we chose those particular socioeconomic indicators to focus on. So with that, I think I will take us now into a case study so that we can actually see a sample application of these SEI metrics and get an idea for how they can add to a policy conversation. So to set up our case study, we'll use a sample scenario based on COVID-19 migration. So of course, from 2020 to 2021, the short-term migration shock that the US saw was pretty unprecedented, with the shift of students and many other like young professionals. A lot of different populations shifted away from urban areas into suburban areas. As I mentioned, students, younger professionals even moved back home into their parents' homes. There was a lot of interstate migration, people moving from urban areas, from cities with strict COVID-19 regulations and restrictions, moving to sort of less restrictive environments, and of course the safety implication, wanting to get away from crowded areas. All of that helped drive the short-term migration shock. And of course, with a massive shock like that, there are national macroeconomic implications. In particular, the ones we'll focus on today are GDP, employment, productivity, and prices. And overall, our approach to this case study is that we are seeing a structural shift in economic geography that is not just temporary, not just an open and shut case, but something that will continue to challenge states and localities on into the next few years. So our analysis here will highlight some of the socioeconomic challenges brought about by COVID-19 migration, like the widening of income, racial, and gender disparities in regional economies. So to illustrate this increase in inequality, this really spread across a number of categories. Wealth inequality during COVID, all asset classes appreciated, thus widening the gap between haves and have-nots. Wage inequality contributed to this as well. The job losses really concentrated in lower wage jobs, more service industry jobs, and those who were able to work remotely and are continuing to work remotely are disproportionately highly educated and wealthier, higher income people who saw wage gains even over the course of the pandemic. So again, widening that gap between the lower wage earners and the higher wage earners. Racial and gender inequality were also extremely evident and exacerbated by this pandemic. So Black and Hispanic workers were disproportionately impacted, women as well, especially in the earlier months when childcare centers and everything were closed down and schools were closed down. Also to note racial and gender inequality, not just from the economic, labor perspective, but also considering the disproportionate health impacts on those groups that also contributed to this inequality. And then of course, educational inequality, as I mentioned, with the wage inequality. The remote workers tended to be able to work remotely because they were higher wage and had high levels of educational attainment, whereas the job market weakened more for the lower wage, the job market weakened more for those with lower levels of educational attainment. Here are just some visualizations kind of helping to illustrate those points I made about the increases in inequality through COVID. Here we just see that the Black and Hispanic workers continue to face higher unemployment rates than other workers from the peak of the pandemic through early 2021. All these coming from the Pew Research Center, by the way. And then during COVID, we saw employment falling more among low-wage workers, or falling by more than 10% among low-wage workers, and labor force participation falling most among women, and specifically among Hispanic and Black women. So just a few illustrations to help show some of those claims from the previous slide. Okay, some summary drivers of this migration include safety considerations, so relocation to family homes, as I mentioned, migration away from densely populated areas, the employment shock, so the major job losses in the services sector, declining employment in retail, restaurants, and tourism, and then, of course, seeking a preferred lifestyle. This was evident in the relocation of people from cities to suburbs and to preferred regions with different amenities. So the question then is, are these factors temporary or a new normal with more permanence? We hold that these are not temporary, that they will have some long-term impacts, and the indication that distance work is sticking around, and that the inertia and network effects of these phenomena are persistent, and that governments, states and localities face a heightened competition to attract people to live in their regions, and the implication there being the need to attract taxpayers. And the question has been raised and maybe more asked in a more pressing manner of whether governments can efficiently finance and provide necessary services. And then on top of all of that, the widening disparities and inequality that I've mentioned in previous slides. These are not, things that will resolve themselves within a matter of months or years. These are long-term challenges to policy that will persist past the COVID pandemic. So the model, or the Tiebout model, will point to as kind of this way that we're thinking about local and state governments competing for firms and residents during this COVID migration shock. So Tiebout model, as a summary, this is a method of sorting where residents choose where to live. They choose which jurisdictions to move to and live in and work in, based on the bundles of public services, public goods, and the tax rates at which they have to pay for that level of particular levels of government services. So it's a migration effect, and that'll be the sense in which we refer to this. But this covers, or the Tiebout effect is evident in the following ways. So when it comes to basic government services, of course, people have different preferences for levels of public safety, education, healthcare, and transportation that they're looking for in a particular jurisdiction. People are also interested in the social policies in a particular region. We think about some current issues at the moment, like abortion rights, things like critical race theory in schools, various gender issues, homelessness, of course, COVID-19 policy in terms of restrictiveness. All of these are part of those bundles of preferences that the people have when they are choosing where they want to live and work. Cost of living and housing affordability, another important factor. Taxation as well. And then this amenity aspect that's a little bit more amorphous, this idea of places with natural amenities that are inherent beneficiaries. So when we think about the phenomenon of COVID migration shock and seeing a lot of people moving to like Mountain West states with nature, natural areas, large open spaces, etc. That's one example of people sort of responding to natural amenities. So with that set up for the case study, we'll go ahead and look at some of our notable results. So the simulation that we ran was built and run through REMI PI+, which is the premier software solution for conducting dynamic macroeconomic impact analysis of public policy. PI+ is our flagship model. Over here, you'll see a kind of high-level structural overview of PI+ and how it works. You'll see that we have these 5 model blocks, and within them, these interrelationships of different factors. So we have an output and demand block, a labor and capital demand block, a population and labor supply block, as well as market share block, and a compensation, prices, and cost block. You can see by these directional arrows here, this is the flows throughout the model of how one piece affects the other. So a pretty simple illustration of our model linkages, excluding our economic geography linkages, just to give you kind of an overview of the functionality of the REMI model. So with that, I'll go ahead and set up our model simulation. So as I mentioned, the model we used was a PI plus model. Specifically, this was a 2-region 70-sector model, which describes the level of industry detail we can get into with that particular model. So 70-sector, meaning the number of industries we could look at. The 2 regions that we looked at were center cities and the rest of the US. These center cities are the top 20 metro areas throughout the United States. And then the rest of the United States is every other county besides those center cities. So the center cities are including things like Chicago, New York, LA, as well as the other top 17 in the country. And the scenario that we modeled, in particular, thinking back to our Tiebout model setup, we're decreasing an amenity factor by 5% in the center cities. So that's our input that we used, and we made no change to the amenity aspect in the rest of the US. So in the years 2020 through 2040, we looked at this decrease in amenity aspects in the center cities by each year, implemented each year over the next 2 decades. That 5% number, that is really just a demo simulation assumption we've made. It's not, the amenity factor would be likely not so clean a number, but for the purpose of example, I've used 5%. All right, so with that, we can begin talking about a few of these notable results from the simulation. So first of all, we see here the economic summary of what is occurring in the center cities from 2020 to 2040. The 3 key indicators here that we're looking at are total employment in those cities, population in those cities, and labor force as well. So we can see declines across the board with pretty steady decline in total employment, a rather deep drop in population over time, and similar decrease in the overall labor force. So really capturing this movement of people out of the center cities with that decreased amenity aspect. To get a closer look at what is driving that shift of people out of center cities, we can look at the components of population change in those center cities. So here you'll see in the graph the rise in economic migration out of those cities. So we see early on in the pandemic, when we first put in, that amenity decrease, that's when there was the greatest number of economic migrants out of the center cities. And by the end of the 2 decades, we do see that economic migration beginning to even out. And just to define economic migrants in terms of what we mean in the REMI model, those are the people, interregional migrants, who are responding to changes in relative compensation rate, relative employment opportunity, whereas like retired migrants are not included in that way because they're not in the labor force. But economic migrants are very responsive to changes in those aspects. So we can see that the most significant loss of people from the center cities is the economic migrants. And we actually see a small but somewhat interesting effect over time of retired migrants moving back into, or migrating to the cities out of the rest of the US. But to a much smaller extent, the most important element here is definitely the economic migrants. Looking now at our compensation rate by industry quintile metric. This is part of our SEI newly developed features. And we're looking here across all regions, so from a nationwide perspective. And we can see a pretty clean illustration of a widening wage gap. So if you'll see here, the lowest 20% and second lowest 20% of all industry quintiles, which, as I mentioned, are calculated regionally and are calculated by average annual compensation rate weighted by employment in the baseline. So those industries are seeing the steady losses over time, especially this lowest 20%, seeing steady losses over the next 2 decades in that compensation rate. While in the meantime, we see an increase for the highest 20%, as well as for the middle 20% and a maybe less marked increase overall for that fourth income quintile. So pretty clearly we see that divergence between the lowest 20% and the highest 20% in this figure. Looking at employment by industry quintile across all regions, we can see that employment in the second lowest 20% sees the most dramatic spike over time. Of course, during the pandemic proper, we see losses across the board in our industry quintiles, as we may expect. But looking over the next 2 decades, we see more so drops for that in employment for the highest 20% and gains for the second 20%, as well as some gains for the middle 20% and some for the lowest 20%, excuse me. We can talk a little bit more too later about why this phenomenon is happening. Employment by race, so looking into these SEI impacts by race and ethnicity, you'll see our 4 categories below coming from the ACS: white, non-Hispanic, black, non-Hispanic, other non-Hispanic, and Hispanic. We can see here that across all regions, the Hispanic ethnic group is really the most disproportionately impacted in a negative sense by change in employment caused by this amenity decrease. The only group to benefit in the simulation is the white non-Hispanic group, and they see a steady rise over our time horizon. We also see losses, the second most dramatic losses occurring to the other non-Hispanic group, and significant losses to the black non-Hispanic group as well. To dig a little deeper into this employment by race phenomena, we can look into the center cities and see here that really that dramatic drop in employment for the Hispanic group is really pronounced in these center cities, and of course it shows up when we looked at all regions combined, but here focusing on those cities, we can see the outsized proportion of the Hispanic group being affected. We also see that when we're focusing just on the center cities, the white non-Hispanic group, is also significantly impacted, although when we look at the entire nation, that was the group that benefited, but in center cities specifically, still losses there, as well as losses for the black non-Hispanic group and the other non-Hispanic group in center cities. Similarly, we can look at employment by gender over time. In the center cities, the most pronounced loss in employment was for the male group, although the female group also saw steady losses over time. And for our final look at these socioeconomic indicators of employment, we can look at employment by educational attainment. And we see that in the final year of our time horizon, year 2040, the loss in that year of jobs to those with lower levels of educational attainment is much larger than the loss to those occupations that have a higher proportion of workers with bachelor's degrees and above. And if we look at all regions nationwide collectively, we see a very small increase of 30 jobs, or not 30 jobs, excuse me, 30,000 jobs and for those without a bachelor's degree and 19,000 for those with a bachelor's degree. So really in the center cities, we see that that differential impact by educational attainment group. Moving on to labor force participation, we'll first look at this by race and ethnicity. You'll see drops in labor force participation by race for the white non-Hispanic group nationwide, with the most notable jump in labor force participation by the other non-Hispanic group, with some significant rises as well for the Black non-Hispanic group. The Hispanic group acts a little bit more a little bit more variation in this graph. So you see some initial drops, a spike here before dropping again and then increasing again in terms of labor force participation. Looking now at labor force participation by gender across all regions in the United States, we see the largest drops in male labor force participation relative to female participation. And just to be clear, the percents over here on the y-axis, this is the percent change from the baseline forecast. So we're seeing a drop of this many, or this percent from the baseline forecast. And here we have a graph of unemployment across all regions. You can see here the rest of the United States having a sort of a slow or a quicker drop in unemployment rate early on during and after the pandemic, sort of a bottoming out and then a slow kind of returning to normal, whereas unemployment in the center cities really spikes and stays high before beginning to come back down. And interestingly, this next result captures personal income per capita across all regions. So you see here that the center cities see a dramatic and consistent increase in personal income per capita, whereas the rest of the US sees a much less pronounced decrease in personal income per capita. I know this result might be a little surprising or confusing, so I would say that one way to interpret this and kind of understand what's going on is to think about the concept of a compensating differential. So considering the input being a decrease in amenity aspects for center cities to maintain workers, they'll have to increase their wage rates relative to the rest of the US to get people to continue living and working in those cities. So that's why we're seeing kind of this raise in personal income per capita for the center cities, in that wage rate will have to increase in order to keep workers there, considering the negative impact on center cities' amenity aspects. Whereas the rest of the US has, no relative change to their amenity aspects. So they are not pressured in the same way to pay higher wages because people want to move there anyway, in this particular simulation. So with that, we will go ahead and maybe just cover a few of our notable results, and then go into some conclusions about the longer term implications of this case study and uses for the SEI framework. So to discuss some of our key results, I broke this up into 4 little categories of employment impacts, labor force implications, compensation and income effects, and demographic changes. So across all regions, we saw the Hispanic group disproportionately impacted in terms of employment, followed by the other non-Hispanic group and the Black non-Hispanic group. Significantly, only the white non-Hispanic group saw gains. Also, those without higher degrees saw greater losses, and the gains in employment for the second lowest industry quintile were most notable, whereas the losses for the highest industry quintile were more pronounced when it comes to employment gains and losses. The labor force implications of this simulation showed that across all regions, the white non-Hispanic group and the male group saw more of a drop in their participation rate over time, whereas the Black non-Hispanic and other non-Hispanic groups were actually joining the labor force at higher rates. Also, when we looked at that result of unemployment rates, we saw a quick rise up to 2029, so about the middle of our time horizon before beginning to reach a new equilibrium. Thinking about compensation and personal income, we saw that that result with the industry quintiles, where that wage gap was really illustrated. The lowest income quintiles being hit the hardest with compensation rate decreases, while the higher income quintiles saw gains. And then, as I just mentioned, with that personal income per capita, there was overall growth in the center cities over time, and that being explainable by the concept of a compensating differential. Demographic changes, we saw that economic migration away from the center cities was very dramatic in the early years and tapering off, and that was the major component of population change in the simulation. There was a small increase of retired migrants coming into the center cities, and of course that being more understandable in terms of retired migrants being non-responsive or much less responsive to things like relative employment opportunity and relative compensation rate, because they are out of the labor force by definition. And of course, we saw those disparities across racial, ethnic, and gender groups highlighted in these population shifts across the US. So in conclusion, the COVID shock caused economic shifts and disruptions for state and local economies, many of which will persist for years. In summary, states and localities will need to compete to attract a workforce and population that is not as traditionally connected to the physical places of work. Similarly, focusing on major city core regions, our analysis shows significant long-term population and job losses. Of course, this tying in pretty closely to that change in a workforce and population, that's able to work remotely, that is not as traditionally connected to physical places of work. And then finally, that migration away from downtowns will have these impacts of widening or income and racial and gender disparities, and that states need to respond to these phenomena to ensure that economic policies are broad-based and inclusive. Of course, these conclusions kind of focus on challenges for the center cities. Maybe a counterbalance of some conclusions and implications we could take away from this study are thinking in terms of, the urban-rural divide. So, the decades-long trend of wealth being concentrated in coastal cities, while more rural and central American states see less of that. There's the potential with an increase in remote work and new preferences by people migrating interregionally, looking for jurisdictions to live and work in. With a change in amenity aspects, cities and coastal cities may kind of lose their appeal over time, and there's a potential for sort of a shifting of that decades-long trend, separating urban from rural in the US. That's one potential outcome that's not necessarily entirely a negative outlook. And of course, that the migration to out of urban areas, out of these center cities, and into the rest of the US, there's also potential for benefits to these jurisdictions that were struggling population-wise before, and now have this opportunity to sort of become a new location, start anew in a way, and really see these shifts from cities to suburban and rural areas. So with that, I will go ahead and open it up for the Q&A session. Thanks for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions.